We recently studied the Sutram 3418, which prescribes the affix ktva. That sutram prescribes the affix ktva following a verbal root when in combination with alam or khalu, expressing the sense of prohibition. Now let us take another sutram which prescribes the affix ktva. This sutram has much wider application. Sutram is 3421 saman kartrikayoho purvakale. This sutram we have referred to previously in our posts and comments. We didn't have it in the document as yet, so we're already kind of familiar with this sutram because we have been using it informally, so to speak. Anuvritti of ktva, of course, comes down from 3418 alankhalvoha pratishedhayoho trachang ktva down to this sutram 3421 samankartrikayoho purvakale. The vritti of this sutram says samankartrikayor dhatvarthayoho purvakale vidyamanad dhatoho ktva syat, which means that the affix ktva is used following a verbal root which denotes a prior action relative to that of another verbal root, provided the agent of both the actions is the same. Now, the vritti of the sutram says dhatvarthayoho, not dhatvoho, because a dhatu is simply a collection of letters, collection of sounds. It cannot have any doer as such. It cannot be earlier in time or later in time relative to another dhatu. All these things cannot apply to a collection of letters. So therefore, obviously what is meant here is dhatvarthayoho, which is the meaning or the action conveyed by the verbal root. Only the action can have a doer and can have a relationship with time. So that is why the vritti says saman kartrikayoho dhatvarthayoho. So means that the agent of both the actions conveyed by these two verbal roots has to be the same. Then what happens is that the verbal root which conveys an earlier action, that takes the affix ktva. Of course, earlier relative to the action conveyed by the other verbal root. Now in the sutram, samana kartrikayoho is shashti dvivachanam, or it can also be taken as a saptami dvivachanam. Now the question comes is that, does that mean that there have to be exactly two actions, only then the affix ktva may be used? And the commentators say that's not the case. So Siddhanta Kaumudi says dvitvam atantram, which means that the use of the dual number in samana kartrikayoho is non-consequential. Atantram is a technical term. It means that it's non-consequential. It does not have any implications. So it does not necessarily mean that the affix ktva applies only when there are exactly two actions. The affix ktva can also apply when there are three or more actions. For example, bhuktva pitva vrajati. So someone goes having eaten and having drunk. There are a total of three actions here. The action of going is the last action. The action of eating is the first action. So, since the action of eating is the first action, we use the affix ktva with the verbal root bhuj as a first step, because that is the earlier action relative to the other two actions. Then among the two remaining actions of drinking and going, the action of drinking is the earlier action, so the verbal root pa takes the affix ktva. Hence it is said that dvitvam atantram, which means that we don't have to have exactly two actions. There may be three or more actions also, and still the affix ktva can be used following the verbal roots which denote all the earlier actions except the last one. That's one note over here. Second note actually we should have mentioned earlier, but it's kind of obvious. It says avyaya krito bhave from the Mahabhashyam. Recall that any krit affix as a default is used to denote the agent of the action as per 3467 kartari krit. Now does that mean that the affix ktva also denotes the agent of the action? Obviously not. The affix ktva denotes only the action itself, what is called as bhavaha. So that is why the Mahabhashyam clarifies that krit affixes having the avyaya sanya are used to denote bhavaha, the action itself, and not the agent of the action. Now note that as per the Sutram 1.140, ktva to sun kasunaha, the words ending in the affixes ktva to sun and kasun are designated as indeclinables. They get the avyaya sanya. So therefore, the affix ktva denotes only bhava, the action itself, and not the agent of the action. Similarly, in the case of the affix tumun, which we studied earlier, that also denotes only the action itself and not the agent of the action. It's kind of obvious, but the Mahabhashyam also clarifies that by this statement, avyakruto bhave. Okay, let us now derive these two forms, bhuktva and pitva. Bhuktva is derived from the verbal root bhuj, which is bhuja palana vyavaharayoho, from the ruzhadiganaha. We start the derivation by taking bhuj plus ktva by this sutram 3421 samankartrika yoho purvakale, because we have here a total of three actions, the action of eating, drinking and going, and eating is the earlier action, so therefore the verbal root bhuj takes the affix ktva. Now let's not also forget the condition that there has to be a common doer for all these actions. Here we are assuming that there is a common doer. For example, devadatta bhuktva pitva vrajati. Devadatta eats and drinks and goes. If the doer of the actions is not the same, we cannot use the affix ktva. For example, Mai bhuktavati devadatto vrajati, which means that after I ate, devadatta goes. So here, even though there are two actions and one is earlier in time than the other, the doers are not the same. So we cannot use the affix ktva with the verbal root bhuj. But in the present example, in bhuktva pitva vrajati, we are assuming there is a single doer of all the actions. So therefore we can use the affix ktva by the sutram 3421 samankartrika yoho purvakale. So now we remove the letter, the kakara at the beginning of ktva gets its sanya by lashakvatadhyate intasya lopaha. Now the affix ktva has a sanya of ardhadhatukam by 34114 ardhadhatukam sheshaha. It is also a valadi pratyaha, begins with the letter t. So therefore it can take the augment it by 7 to 35 ardhadhatukasya valadehe, but then 7 to 10 ekach upadeshe nudatat comes and stops the augment it, because the verbal root bhuj is ekach and it has anudatta swaraha in the dhatu patha. So 7 to 10 prohibits the augment it, and then of course kiniticha 115 prevents puganta laghupatasya cha 7386. So no gunadesha, because the affix ktva is a kit. So we have bhuj tva, then we apply choho kuhu, because the jakaraha belongs to the cha vargaha, which is followed by jal letter takaraha. So we get the kavargadesha, we get bhug tva, and finally we apply kharicha 8455 to get the form bhuktva, which gets the pradipadika sanya by krit tadita samasascha 1 to 46 and the avyaya sanya by 1140 ktva to sun kasunaha. Now for the form pitva, we start with the verbal root pa pane. Similar steps here also. 7 to 10 eka chopadeshe nudatat stops the augment it, which would have been done by 7 to 35. And now we apply 6466 gumastha ga pa jahati sam hali to replace the akaraha of pa by ikaraha, because it is followed by the pratyaha ktva, which is a kit affix beginning with a consonant, and it has a sanya of ardhadhatukam. Now 115 kiniticha stops any gunadesha which may have been done by 7384 sarvadhataka ardhadhataka yoho. So this is how we get the form pitva, which gets the pradipadika sanya by 1 to 46 krittadita samasascha and the avya sanya by 1140 ktva to sun kasunaha.